All right, welcome to The Explainer. Today we're diving into something pretty huge for anyone who works with the logiBUS programming environment. We're talking about a change that gets rid of a massive headache, a huge source of frustration and errors that's been around for, well, for years. Yep, we're talking about the end of mapping.
Okay, so to really get our heads around this, let's start with an analogy. Imagine your code, your program, is this perfectly organized, super efficient office. Everything's in its right place. But to connect that office to the outside world, to make a phone call, to send a letter, you have to use this old, separate, handwritten address book. Now, what happens if you move a department? Well, you have to remember to go find that one book and manually scribble out the old address and write in the new one. Sounds kind of fragile, right? Easy to forget? Well, that is exactly what developers were dealing with.
So, that handwritten address book in our little story. In the logiBUS world, that was a system called mapping. And for a long time, it was the only way you could connect your beautiful visual code to the real, physical world of buttons, switches, and displays.
And here's the really crucial part to understand. This mapping was a completely separate text file. It lived outside your visual program. So you'd be in your main application, dragging and dropping these nice, clean visual blocks, and you'd have a generic input block. But what is that input? You'd have to jump over to this other file, this text file, and literally type out a path that says, okay, that generic input block is actually the physical red button number 5 on the control panel. A total disconnect.
And you can see here just how messy this got. The system basically forced every single function into what the source material calls a 3-pack of files. You had the visual code, you had its container, and then you had that pesky mapping file. Think about that. Just to understand one single function, you're digging through folders and opening up multiple files. It just made projects so cluttered and, honestly, a real nightmare to navigate.
So this structure wasn't just, a little inconvenient. It created some very real, very painful problems for developers. The creator of logiBUS himself actually called it a break in the system.
All right, pain point number 1. This is maybe the most obvious one. You're working in a completely visual world. logiBUS is all about dragging and dropping blocks, connecting lines with your mouse. It's intuitive, but then, for arguably one of the most important jobs, connecting your code to the actual hardware, bam, you're yanked out of that visual paradise and forced to become a typist, carefully writing out these long, precise text-based paths. It was just jarring.
And this one? Oh man, this one was an absolute killer. So, picture this. You're doing some good housekeeping on your project. You move a block of code into a new sub-application to keep things clean and tidy. Great. Except, you also had to remember to go find that separate mapping file and manually update the text path to point to the new location. And if you forgot, which, let's be honest, happened all the time, your program would just break. It wouldn't work. And the worst part? There'd be no error in your visual code. You'd be staring at it thinking everything looks perfect, while the problem was hidden away in that text file you forgot about.
And then, on top of all of that, there was just the sheer inefficiency of it all. For some functions, like say showing a soft key status on a screen, you'd have to define that connection in your code, and then you'd have to go define the exact same connection all over again in the mapping file. You're literally doing the same work twice. It's just a classic recipe for introducing typos and mistakes.
And hey, you don't have to take my word for how frustrating this was. This quote says it all, and it comes straight from the system's creator. He admits that even he would finish building an application and just completely forget to do the mapping. I mean, when the main architect of the whole system calls a process tedious and says he forgets to do it himself, you know you've got a fundamental problem on your hands.
So after laying out all those problems, you might think the solution was to, make mapping a little bit better. But no, the solution they came up with was way more radical and, frankly, a lot more elegant.
What was the solution? Simple. They got rid of it. The entire mapping system, just gone. That whole extra layer of complexity, that separate handwritten address book we talked about, poof, it doesn't exist anymore.
And I mean, just look at the difference here. It is absolutely night and day. On the left, you've got the old way, this mess of nested folders for every little thing. On the right, the new structure. It's flat, it's clean, and because those mapping files are gone, you can just glance at the project tree and immediately understand what each part of your application is doing. No more digging.
So how did they pull this off? Well, this is the magic right here. This is the core of the whole change. Before, you had this generic block called IX. What was it? A button? A sensor? Who knows? You had to go look it up in the mapping file. But now the block itself tells you what it is. It's not a generic input, it's a button EX block. It's a soft key EX block. The connection to the physical hardware is baked right into the block. It's no longer a separate piece of information.
Okay, so that's the how. But what about the so what? What does this actually mean for you, the developer, on a day-to-day basis? Let's talk about the real benefits of living in this new mapping-free world.
Honestly, this quote from the creator really just says it all. The big advantage for me is I see immediately what this is. And that's it, right there. You look at your visual code, you see a button EX block, and you know, instantly, that it's a physical button. No more switching your brain into text file mode. No more opening another window to connect the dots. The code just explains itself.
So when you put it all together, the benefits are just massive. First, clarity. Your code is basically self-documenting now. Second, robustness. You've literally eliminated an entire class of errors caused by typos or just forgetting to update that text file. Then there's efficiency. No more doing the same work twice. And finally, simplicity. The whole project structure is flatter and way more intuitive, which is a huge, huge win, especially for anyone new coming onto a project.
Okay, but it can't be all sunshine and roses, right? There has to be a trade-off, and there is one, and it's an important one to get. Because these blocks are now so specific, they're less generic. You can't just easily swap an input from, say, a logiBUS input to a data panel input anymore. If you want to change the hardware type, you now have to actually delete the old block, drop in the new specific one, and configure its properties right there.
So that naturally leads to the next big question. What if you're sitting on an existing project that was built the old way? How do you get from that world of mapping into this new, cleaner environment?
Well, the process is described as being pretty methodical, and yeah, it's a manual one. Step 1, you update your libraries so you have all the new specific blocks available. Step 2, you have to go through your code and replace every single one of those old generic IX and QX blocks with the new shiny ones. Step 3, reconnect all your logic. And then the most satisfying part, step 4, you delete all those old mapping files and helper blocks forever.
Now, the source material is very honest about this. It says the conversion process is no fun. And yeah, it's probably not. But it's framed as a strictly one-time task. It's like cleaning out the garage. You do that big, painful cleanup once, and in return you get a project that is just fundamentally easier to understand, easier to maintain, and way easier to debug for the rest of its life.
And that really brings us to the final, central question for everyone in the logiBUS community. You're basically weighing a one-time headache against a permanent improvement in clarity and stability. For the promise of killing off an entire category of bugs and making your code speak for itself, is that initial effort worth the switch? It's a big question, but it seems pretty clear which way the creators are betting.